Welcome to the Priestess Mercury podcast. This is our second episode. I'm Matt Treese with In Transit Astrology, and with me, as always, is Michelle Bloom. Michelle, you want to say hi?
Hello. Welcome to number 2.
And so today, we're just gonna kind of pick up with where things are at. Last episode, we talked about the lunar eclipse that happened in Gemini. And today we'll probably start off talking about the upcoming solar eclipse, and keeping in mind that these things happen in pairs twice a year. We tend to have a lunar and solar eclipse that come together.
And a good way to think about the eclipses that come in pairs twice a year is it's like a deep cleaning for your psyche, for your soul. It's like spring cleaning and fall cleaning, So, and the lunar is like they both kind of, how normally with the full moon, it's all about letting go, full moon to new moon, and new moon to full moon, the waxing is normally about planting seeds and initiating and activating. But when the eclipses get involved, because they're always connected, lunar to the full moon eclipse and solar eclipse to the new moon, it kind of makes them both, the full moon and the new moon, is cleansing, as releasing, cleansing, and letting go as it is initiating, activating, and starting anew.
Yeah, I mean, you get them in a kind of you get like a 6-month kind of letting go of the last 6 months and moving into the next 6 months. That there's a chance to kind of start a new story, to see what that new story is, to let go of the extra baggage that we've accumulated. It's good to kind of clear that kind of folder out, keep things fresh and new, and keep moving and planting and being active.
And with the releasing the old and bringing in the new, again, just a reminder that Gemini Sagittarius is all about the mind. Gemini is the logical or the lower mind, the ego mind. Mm-hmm. And Sagittarius is the upper mind, the wisdom, the mental, the spirit mind. And also, I was just watching report that was saying the last time we had the solar eclipse Sagittarius was winter 2001 going into 2002. So you can also go back to that winter around this time in 2001, and it's not going to be a literal replica, but at least to kind of see the theme, because Sagittarius is always going to be talking about a theme of expansion.
Right.
Especially with learning new things that are more spiritual or philosophical in nature.
Yeah, and how that jives with what we notice sensorily, which would be kind of the Gemini aspect of things too. So that tension between those impulses of...
Yeah, the tension between what your senses tell you and what your logic tells you, and then what your soul and your spirit tell you.
Mm-hmm.
And even when we say what it tells you, I mean, a lot of it is about reaching out, like taking that class, that course, getting an astrology reading, a tarot reading, going into therapy, signing up for a workshop, reading a new book. It's very much about extending outward in order to expand your mind and in order to grow your soul.
Yeah. Yeah. And along those lines, like Michelle was saying, like what's extremely helpful about astrology is getting in the flow of the cycles. It's not just about the analyzing and knowing all of the rote things about these signs, but seeing like when these things happen, what's going on in my life? How is this? How is this helpful? So noticing like the last time I had, you know, the eclipses in Sagittarius. Personally, I was going through grad school for the first time, and so a very Sagittarian kind of thing.
Very
Uh,
Sag.
and having to learn how to, how my logic has to get scrutinized and work within these kind of larger theoretical and structural thought frameworks. And that, you know, that was a difficult kind of learning period. And so now I'm kind of back, you know, and thinking about it on a different level. I'm not in school anymore, but I'm thinking about, you know, uh, for instance, like how do I deal with friends that have, you know, are trying to convince me with like conspiracy theories on various topics, and or you know, trying to convince me about the economy or politics, and
Right.
I'm
What's
having to
your
like,
belief? What's your beliefs
yeah,
around the higher, or I don't want to say the higher story, but the larger narrative, as opposed to other people's beliefs? Because the Gemini, you're right, because the Gemini part is like all of our chirping beliefs, blah, blah, blah. It's this, it's that. This is the truth. That's the truth. It's
and it's
everyone chirping,
changeable,
and
very
it's
changeable.
changeable. And then Sagittarius is like, what's the higher wisdom in all of that? You know, which makes me think when you share that about everyone's different beliefs and searching for your own, or, you know, that the like Sagittarius in its higher form isn't just a belief system. It might be a higher truth, like love is more important than belief systems.
Right.
And if I'm not coming from, like, I think for myself, I think if I'm not coming from a place of love, then I'm not coming from truth. So if I'm holding a certain belief system, like about the world, and it's in opposition to somebody else's belief system, and again, we're not talking about racism or prejudice or any of the hatred things, just beliefs. Then if I'm like telling that person that thinks differently that they're stupid, I'm not coming from love, and therefore I'm not coming from truth.
Right. And
And
there's a
such,
difference. Yeah, there's a difference between setting a boundary for like what you know, how far you'll go with talking with someone about a belief, and you know, railroading their belief. Like, you know, you need to be able to set your own boundary and know like, what do I believe, and how can that
and before even
work with
getting to
somebody else?
boundaries, which isn't Sagittarius, Sagittarius is like, what's your truth? Like, for
Right.
instance, I might believe that COVID is not a conspiracy, and but my higher truth is that I want to respect and honor all people, so that if somebody does believe that, I'm not making them feel stupid.
Right. It's not that
Even
they're
though,
stupid at all.
and I hate bringing in the COVID thing, actually, I just realized, because it brings in a whole, again, boundaries and the threat that we feel for our lives because of the pandemic is going into another area, which we're not gonna, I'm just gonna name it, and let's get back, which would be more
Right.
Plutonian, Pluto.
We're not here
We're
to
not gonna
argue.
talk
This
about
isn't a
Pluto.
politics podcast per
Well,
se.
no, and what I'm trying to, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about, I'm using a bad example with, well, no, it's not a bad example. It's
It's a real
actually
example. Yeah.
showing, let me just get this out here, because I feel like I want to just clarify what I mean is that the part where our lives feel threatened because we're actually dealing with the pandemic is under Pluto's domain.
Hmm.
So we're not, and Pluto's getting very aspected now too, but we're not going to talk about that right in this moment. In the Sagittarius moment, what I really want to share is the discernment and differentiation between truth and belief.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm using myself as an example that I have these beliefs about the world, the pandemic, but those aren't my truths.
Right.
My truth for me personally, which is this is the eclipse. What is your truth? Sagittarius solar eclipse. What is your truth? My truth is to always come from love. That's my truth. It may not be your truth, so you got to find your own truth. That's my truth. So that's going to take priority. That's going to create the new narrative, the new, maybe old me wanted to hold on to the belief and argue it, or maybe the old me shadowed, in my shadow, I felt I was right. And then I'm acting on the surface like I think all people are right, but in this eclipse, it's like, okay, we're currently in a world right now where beliefs are playing a central theme.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of complexity to that and what it's creating for your own narrative in your own life, and then in relationship with other people. And maybe last time in 2001, I mean, I remember I was starting to read tarot professionally right at the tail end, beginning of 2002. And I was also entering a program to learn hypnotherapy and Reiki and NLP. So lots of expansion in that Sagittarian way with tarot and all those. But now we're in a whole new realm with this pandemic and the country and everything we're going through. It's there's different priorities going on right now.
Yeah, things are shifting and changing, and it's hard to know what what to believe in a certain sense. Like there are a lot of conflicts that are arising because of that, and it's important to tap into the truth about what's important to you.
Yeah.
Within that.
What the truth is, what's important in your heart, in your soul, because there are a lot of opposing beliefs that are life-threatening level.
Right.
It's a whole different ball game when there's a global pandemic. It's a whole different ball game when the government wants how much control the government's going to take with that and different people's feelings and thoughts around that. So different than 2001, although just remembering back to 9/11 was right before the eclipse season. So of course, these themes that we're dealing with in government and power, again, this is Pluto's reign, and it's been going for a very long time. But just right now with the eclipses, with the Sagittarius solar eclipse coming up on Monday, it is an inquiry. Like, what is my truth now?
Mm-hmm.
Not what it was, and you want to reflect, what has it been and what is it now? What's the higher truth versus just my beliefs?
Right.
Because that's the container, that's the new narrative. This, if I know my higher truth is love, and I'm having a conversation with someone that has an opposing belief and I feel threatened by their opposing belief, and I check in and I go, okay, love is my highest truth, I will communicate. Instead of communicating in a way that's condescending or mean, I might say, your belief, I feel threatened by your belief. My safety feels threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to respect your belief, and I feel threatened. Just that alone. Just that alone. No solution. Not trying to have total control, but just that's my truth.
Yeah, acknowledging also what's kind of behind that and driving it and why it's important to you in particular, not just like why it's important writ large.
Right. The personal importance, which is very Gemini. Gem and I, the truth in the me. Yeah, it's like, this is important to me because, and not immediately jumping into it just being this global, belief. And if you don't have it, that global belief, then, F you, or you're stupid, or it's very challenging when, just to bring in a little of the psychology, it's very challenging when our nervous systems are feeling so threatened, because when the nervous system is triggered and we go into fight, flight, or freeze, we don't have control over our narrative. We don't have
Right.
a center to go, I'm going to choose my truth right now. It's like reactive. We're all a bunch of reacting, scared animals right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been one of those years. And
And
not
so,
just, yeah, not just astrologically speaking. You don't even have to look at uh, any kind of theory or anything to know that it's been a year to test everyone's kind of uh, nervous system.
right. And I think Matt and I both, our intention is to want to ground astrology in the human experience and bring it to the heart and the body and the human experience, and not have it where it can tend to go, just be this philosophical inquiry and analytical thing. We want it to be grounded in the human experience. And I think, again, Pluto has a lot to do with the nervous system, maybe even Mercury. I mean, like, as soon as I feel into it, it kind of feels like Mercury is the nervous system, and that our nervous systems have a life of their own.
Mm-hmm.
So, but this podcast isn't about that. So, bringing it back to Sagittarius and creating that new narrative of discovering, where is my truth now?
Yeah. Uh, and, and taking a step back uh, and just owning what is yours, um,
Yes, owning what is yours.
and trying, and no one's perfect at it. I mean, even this morning, I felt like I got roped into a conversation, and I'm, just trying to find a place where I can just back off and be like, hey, I, you know, I'm not, I don't really have an axe to grind here. This isn't that, like, here's how I'm feeling. Um, and I'm feeling a little bullied. Uh, and in that place, and I'm coming out of that, and I don't necessarily want to squash or dismiss what you're saying, but I do want to acknowledge that it's raising my own interior truth hackles.
Yeah, just that part of sharing how you feel. I mean, this is communication 101, and Gemini is all about communication. To always start out with, I feel. I'm feeling bullied. I'm feeling threatened. The what you are sharing, as I'm listening, I notice how scared I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And that, starting off from that place.
Yeah, there were a couple of points where I was texting back and forth, and I just wanted to be like, hey, I grew up in a very fundamentalist religious home where I didn't get allowed to have any say in like what the truth is for me, and where I come from, and my opinion got railroaded a lot of the time, and so I don't really appreciate or
Yeah.
it it I'm not going to respond very well to that kind of discussion.
The railroading discussion, which is the shadow side of Sagittarius, where it's dogmatic, I'm right, you're wrong, and it's just pure dogma. And so many people grew up in very fundamentalist homes and didn't get the opportunity as little kids to say, this is what I'm curious about. You were just
Hmm.
told what the truth is, and that's it. You weren't taught, like Gemini. Gemini is like, let your brain discover, be curious. Like Gemini key phrases would be, I'm curious, I'm open,
Hmm.
I desire to explore ideas.
Yeah, and I feel like for me, like it took me a long time to uh, own that Geminian kind of space where it's like my own intuition, my own senses, what I was told what my senses were supposed to be telling me, but
Yeah.
I didn't always get a chance to trust uh, those senses.
Right, because if you're not attuned to as a kid, if your parentals or your caretakers or caretaker aren't saying to you, what do you think? What are you curious
Hmm.
about? If you're just told what's true, like this is the way it is, then you do grow up with your ego, your conscious self, not feeling secure to think for yourself, not feeling secure in your own intuition. And most of us, I would say that's most people.
Hmm.
Most people, whether you grow up fundamentalist or some sort of rigid, fixed kind of structure in the home life where it's like, this is what it is, this is the truth. This is what's real. This is life. Get used to it. There's a very rigid, fixed, salty attitude because of the toxic patriarchy, throughout
Yeah.
history. So just finding your own truth, your own Gemini, and truth, Sagittarius, that's a difficult journey.
Yeah.
It's not easy.
Yeah. And so, like, to bring that into the astrology in a kind of personal sense, that for me, like, when I think of my Mercury in Sagittarius, that's very much like what comes up for me is that pattern of being put in these situations where I'm being told that my intuition, my senses are wrong, and that I need to get it right and get in line with everybody else. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think about where your Mercury is in your natal chart. Your communication can also be how you were communicated with, not just your way of communicating.
right.
So, like, if you have and I have that Mercury in Sagittarius as well, we can look at that. Like, if you have Mercury in Sagittarius, you do speak in truths and philosophies, as
Hmm.
Matt and I both, that is what we do all the time. And also how maybe growing up, how maybe you were receiving Sagittarian, like you growing up in the fundamentalist environment, the
Right.
shadow of Sagittarius, the dogmatic.
Which then, like, well, almost around that time that we had those eclipses in Sagittarius, I started delving into poetry, and particularly like poetry that's off the beaten path a little bit, a little more outside the mainstream. uh, that gets down to kind of channeling what the intuition and the senses are receiving in a moment. Very spontaneous composition kind of stuff. And I spent and I still practice it. I've been at that for the last 20 years. So
I mean, it totally feels like the Gemini lunar eclipse part of 2001 and reclaiming your own way to communicate, your own style. And, that as I know you to be, the poet is like your soul, like it's your soul self is the poet in you,
mhm.
and reclaiming that. And it's interesting as you share this, I'm thinking back as well to 2001 for me. And that was when I first started reading tarot professionally for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in a way a reclaiming for me, because it was just allowing myself to communicate my own intuition at the Vajra, with whoever sat with me, and like just allowing myself to be the Gemini communicating the Sagittarius. And for me, it was also a breakaway from, I eventually did return to academia and get my master's, and I'm doing therapy, but I'm doing it from the place of the priestess. I'm doing it from the place I've reclaimed it.
Right.
I'm bridging in tarot and astrology. And that, when I think back to that winter, 2001 into 2002, that was actually a very key, because these eclipses are initiations. They're big, long initiations. And that was
Right.
an initiation into professional reading.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was learning all that other stuff too. But I think it was like, that was reclaiming my sense of authority as a divine feminine mouthpiece.
Yeah.
So just like the poet, the poet, the healer, the tarot reader. So that's been our stories. And even if your story is, it doesn't matter, it doesn't need to be, spiritual and creative. It can look like anything. It can.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when we're talking archetypes, like it's very important. And this is why, like, with astrology, the important part about getting a reading, for instance, is not for the person to kind of tell you your fortune, although, that can happen. But it's that conversation that you have where you're able to talk out and talk through what these archetypes and how they particularly manifested in your own life. Because then knowing the timing cycles and everything gives you a sense of agency, uh, a sense of understanding and assuredness, and a little bit of security about being able to take the next step, being able to
But
do something.
yeah, to like go further with that, working with the archetypal energy. What is an archetype? And an archetype is transpersonal, meaning bigger than the self, beyond the self. And just like Mother Earth, or Earth, Father Earth, however you refer to Earth, is a larger body that we belong to. And then the Milky Way is a larger body. So these archetypes are invisible. They're not planetary. Well, they are. When we're talking about Mercury, they're planetary bodies. But when we're talking about the archetype of Mercury or Gemini or Sag, we're not talking about the planetary body. Just like we have souls and our souls are invisible, and we have bodies, and the body is not the part that's on the soul journey. It's its own consciousness. So an archetype, when we're saying the archetype of Sagittarius, this is a beyond the self, a transpersonal, sentient, conscious of itself energy that we belong to. Like we all belong to them. They're the collective, they are collective energies, sentient energies we all belong to, that we all inherit just by being born. And so when you like reconnect with them consciously, you're always connected to them. We're always connected to the invisible realms and the transpersonal energies. When you consciously connect, which astrology is one way to do that, it's one map, then it's like you're supported. Then you suddenly have the support of these energies, and they help you, and they come through us and help us. And that's really what astrology is. They're not ideas. It's not like Sagittarius, Gemini, Mercury, and all this are ideas. They're living entities, living deities, living forces of nature, forces of spirit that make up the network of being alive.
Right. And we recognize them by seeing the patterns and how they play out in our own lives.
Right.
And astrology just gives us a language within which to talk about it.
Yeah, astrology gives us a language and a map.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very mysterious. It's like the moment you come out of the womb, that first breath you take is your natal chart, is your birth chart in astrology. So it's you know, when you understand that what we're talking about here in this belief structure, Sagittarius, what we're communicating here, Gemini, is that nobody, nothing is separate. Just because we're in a separate body that appears separate with a name doesn't mean we're separate. We are connected. Everything is connected, and in the invisible worlds, it's way more connected. Like if you could see the invisible realms, you'd see that we're like, my conscious me talking right now is connected to the entire network of the universe. This is how it is. This is nature. So
Right.
it's really connecting to that. And then astrology, yeah, it's a language. It's like, okay, we are naming the unnameable. I mean, Mercury doesn't really have a name, but we're naming it.
Right.
It's just like an energy. So when you're talking about a place to feel secure, like when you get your chart read and you start to understand yourself through the natal chart, that sense of security, it's a container. It's like you're allowing yourself to reconnect with this larger transpersonal container, and
Yeah.
then you can consciously work with the archetypes.
Yeah. It's a way of um, bringing the mental part of the mind into contact with the spiritual drive behind it that energizes it.
Right,
Uh,
connecting the mind to the spirit.
yeah, so it's an active kind of inquiry, so to speak, to kind of put some form around it, to give it a shape, and that's why it's important for you to be able to do it, uh, kind of work through it on your own a little, with the guide of a good astrologer would help you to be able to do that, and to talk through it.
Yeah, exactly. The astrologer, just like the tarot reader, just like the therapist, any verbal healer, any healer using communication is a guide.
Yeah, books too. That's kind of what you're doing when you're reading a book. You're taking a guide through giving shape to the world and the universe and understanding it, even when it's like a fictional story. It's still like playing with the archetypes. That's why it's easiest probably to even see like the idea of an archetype in like these stories and movies that repeat themselves over and over again.
Yeah, you see the
Trope.
archetypes in the patterns. They come alive. And like when we're looking, sometimes tarot is easier to understand than astrology at first because it's not connected to planetary bodies at all. You know, when you're looking
Right.
at like the archetype of the Empress in the tarot, it's like the desire every single person has to create life. That desire, whether that be creating a child, a work of art, a garden, whatever desire to create, that is the Empress moving through you, moving through us. It's a transpersonal, collective, sentient energy that has a life of its own. The Empress is going to create life whether you're here or not, but it needs you to create life through you because it's invisible, you know?
Right.
So that's how it is in astrology too. There's this sentient Sagittarius energy, and it's the energy of of truth seeking, of giving a narrative to truth, not just letting it be something unknown to the mind, but bringing it to light in the mind.
Mm-hmm.
It's the truth seeker archetype. So when it comes as the solar eclipse, And anytime we're dealing with the moon, when we're dealing with eclipses, we're dealing with the moon. And whenever we're dealing with the moon, we're dealing with the soul, the subconscious, the mother, the inner child. We're dealing with our emotions, our soul's journey through the lifetimes.
Yeah.
So, you bring in Sagittarius, the truth-seeking energy, to the soul. What is the truth of my soul?
Mm-hmm.
And how is that truth different than my emotional reactivity?
Right. Yeah, because the moon being often the emotional body itself, the instinctive.
The instinctive, yeah. And the instinct and the soul, and again, it's like everyone's going to define this differently, but the soul and the instinct are either the same or connected. If you don't believe in the soul, you're going to just say the instinct.
Right. Well, what we're talking about is the very fine line difference between just pure biological instinct, or the physiological nerves that do things based on the DNA, but also the intuition, which is also kind of shaped by those same kind of spiritual patterns, your connection to the collective,
The soul,
unconscious, the soul.
the invisible aspect of the self that travels through lifetimes, that leaves the body when the body dies and is reborn, either back into the body, into another life form on another planet or dimension, whatever it's doing. The soul is the eternal part of self that carries on.
Right.
And that's a belief. For some, it's a truth. For me, it's a truth. And if somebody says to me, I don't believe in that, that's not my truth, I can say, okay, well, I don't need to convince you, because my highest truth is love.
Yeah, there's that recognition that, in particular, when we talk about beliefs in the spiritual realm of life, that there is a necessity for someone to have an experience of it in order to, like, there's not going to be a belief if there hasn't been an active experience of that.
Although I think I actually
soul.
disagree, because I think a lot of people believe in spiritual concepts without having a felt sense.
Right. Well, there is a cultural passing on of spiritual beliefs.
And
I
also
mean,
a
I grew up in
cultural,
a spiritual community. I mean, I didn't necessarily have a direct personal experience of it per se until later, but
yeah, I mean, I think that you can have it culturally handed down to you through your parents or culture. I think you can also hold on to a spiritual belief to make your mind feel better. And a lot of the atheist types might think that's what all spiritual belief is, like that's the end point to it. And then you can have the felt experience. And I had a felt experience when I was little, like 5 years old, where all of a sudden this sentence popped into my head that said, I am me. I've always been me. I will always be me. I may not remember who me was, and I may not know who me is going to be, but I'll always know it's me. That was exactly how the sentence came in, and it's always been a tattoo in my brain. And with that sentence, when I was just a little girl, I felt my soul. And from that moment on, it was always strong in me as this strong felt experience of soul. And for my path, my life, I've always had these strong felt experiences of past lives, future lives, what happens when you die. I mean, all of this stuff is in my memory. It's my felt experience, and that's my truth. And if I'm talking to someone who has an atheist belief system and has never had a felt experience of the soul or an afterlife or any of these spiritual things, you know, then it's up to me to go, well, you're wrong, or you're just a young soul. Or I could say, you have a different experience of being human than I do.
Mm-hmm.
And Gemini, the Gemini part allows, can't the two exist together? Like, why do we have to make it all one belief, right? It's like, can't we just
Mm-hmm.
be like, that's cool. You know, you can not have an
Right.
experience of soul, and I can have an experience of soul, and both get to exist in this world.
Right. And there's a way of thinking about it that it's that we all have these experiences, and the way that we shape them with words or thought systems uh, can vary. That the truth behind it is something maybe beyond language. And
Yeah.
so when we have a conflict or disagreement, we're having a disagreement about language and not necessarily about dismissing each other's truths.
Yeah, it's almost as if the dismissing each other's truths is something other than truth itself. It's
Right.
another part of us, our more animal reactive self, our more, you know, or egoic self, something different that is the need inside to dismiss an opposite or different languaged version of what life is on a spiritual level.
Right.
uh, when the higher truth, like you're saying, Matt, it's beyond language. It's beyond, you can't stuff it into language. Like, language is way too small for it. And it's also alive. So it's always shifting and changing. It's so much larger. And just to stay really humble and grounded in the understanding that, you know, we're in a human form with 5 senses and a certain kind of brain that limits our capacity to metabolize life itself to a very specific thing. It's like I can only metabolize life as a human being with 5 senses and a brain and a soul. That's the best I can do, you know. So not, you know, it's like kind of like we can't really, if you're going to say this is the absolute truth, that's pretty arrogant and pompous. Now I will say it, you know, but I say it with a conviction and a laugh. Like, I feel like I do know what happens when I die. I have memories, I have experiences of it,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't need to make other people see it my way, and I can laugh and chuck it all to the sky, you know, which I think, you know, just getting really meta right now, I think our agenda, both you and I, with the Sagittarius Mercury, is the freedom, is wanting to restore freedom. Like, the
Mm-hmm.
highest truth is you get to believe whatever you want, and you get to experience life however you experience life, and nobody can take that away from you.
Right.
Like, we both, you and I, have a strong desire to promote that sense of truth.
Yeah. And and while I have a desire to see other people have that type of experience, um, it's no use forcing anyone to try to have it.
Right,
Um,
you can't force somebody to allow everyone the freedom to believe what they want to believe or see truth how they want to see truth. There are, you know, there's going to be people that say, my truth is the only truth. Jesus is the only God. There is no God. If you think there's a God, you're wrong. There are going to be those people too.
mm-hmm.
And again, that goes back to the Gemini archetype, which is like, it all exists.
Mm-hmm.
Shitty and great, mean and kind.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about that I like about astrology is that um, the chart is a wheel and it has everything in it. So, I know people will talk about how, I'm a Sagittarius, or I have a moon in Aquarius or whatnot. But we all those archetypes are there, so they're all there in our own experience.
Yeah,
So yeah, so what people bring to you is what they bring to you. So trust what they say. You don't have to convince them to be
well,
anything.
you're
Well, I
getting
mean,
caught. You're getting caught in it. Like, convincing is on the wheel too.
yeah.
So I think our conversation is such a great example of Gemini Sagittarius energies going back and forth, because our Sag keeps coming through our conversation, the Sagittarius energy of, again, wanting to bring freedom. Don't try to convince people. You get to have your truth. We are very much promoting a specific truth there of
Yeah.
freedom. And then when it goes back to the Gemini part, it's like, and there's going to be people who will always try to convince you of their truth.
Right.
Convincing is on that wheel too. There is the wheel, it's all things. That's, on the wheel of astrology, we are all the signs, we are all the planets, we are all the things. And it's kind of like the fingerprint, the unique fingerprint. We each have a unique combination of those things. Matt and I, just to keep it really specific with the fingerprint of Mercury Sagittarius, are always going to have an unconscious compulsion to bring freedom. So in our conversation, you'll hear it over and over. You'll hear us, don't try to convince, all truths are valid. That's because we have Mercury Sag. So we both are Sagittarius is all about freedom.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where we're always coming from. Now, somebody who has a Mercury in Capricorn is kind of like the structure of Earth,
Mm-hmm.
might not be talking about the freedom to believe whatever you want, might be in this same conversation saying, there's a hierarchy, there's a structure in nature, and that's just the way it is. And look at Darwin, and look at, and bringing up all these examples that are earthy and limiting and
Mm-hmm.
structured.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about that particular archetype, that Mercury and Capricorn would be like feeling that organic need to build up kind of policy and structure and rules from the ground up.
And communicating from a place of structure.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we're tangenting a little, we should bring it back to the eclipses. I think Matt and I in our conversation are really exemplifying Sagittarius Gemini energy. So it's like, that's kind of, the thing right now is like asking yourself, like, what is my truth?
Mm-hmm.
What am I compelled to share with other people all the time?
Right.
Because the truth will come through whether you're aware of it or not. Like, oh, I'm noticing that Matt and I keep talking about freedom. We're not explicitly saying freedom, 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 but we're constantly saying things like everyone should believe what they want to believe and don't try to convince. You can see a constant desire in
Freedom
us.
and diversity.
Freedom and diversity. Gemini is diversity. Sagittarius is freedom. Yeah. So, and the way you can bring that into your own life is thinking about what's your truth, what makes you feel the most free or the most connected to truth, and how can you diversify, right? Like, are you rigidly holding on to just one idea, or can you be open to lots of ideas? Are you only looking at life or yourself or whatever it is through one lens, or can you look through a few different lenses and stay open and stay curious?
Yeah.
Kind of comes down to that.
Yeah, staying curious and flexible, I think, is the other. And both Sagittarius and Gemini don't do well with rigidity.
Except
They're
except Sag in its shadow, which is pure rigidity.
Well, Gemini will do that too, because it's
Yeah,
just like it
Gemini
has
shadow.
to be the senses. It has to be, that's that kind of
Right.
hardcore
Yeah.
science.
Yeah, Gemini, right. The Gemini shadow would be science only. If you can't detect it with the five
It
senses,
doesn't exist.
it doesn't
That's the
exist.
Gemini shadow. Yeah. And
Totally.
neither of those do well with rigidity. They lead to like awful places for like very lonely places, I would say, for people,
Yeah.
because you kind of get stuck
Separate.
in a place where you're separated from everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, to kind of bring us around to what's happening after the eclipse, that's kind of what we might think about with the archetype of Aquarius.
Yeah, that's the other thing we wanted to talk about was the big event that's of Jupiter and Saturn lining up at 0 degrees Aquarius.
Yeah, kicking off 200 years of these types of conjunctions in air signs. We've been in earth signs, with
For
with the
200 years.
exception of the 1981 conjunction, which was in Libra. But we've had since 1802 conjunctions in these conjunctions in earth signs. So you know,
Jupiter and Saturn you're talking about?
yeah, the Jupiter Saturn conjunctions
Yeah,
that,
so we should bring this down the ground, talk about what Jupiter is, what Saturn is, and what a
yeah,
conjunction
exactly. Yeah, that, and and then thinking about what air is in terms of the
and the
elemental
elements.
property, because that's that's a lot. That's a huge shift.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
huge shift. Yeah, so Saturn and Jupiter. So Saturn is the archetype of, it's like limitation,
mhm.
karma, what contains you. Like you're limited by your body, the karma of your soul in the body, what restricts you, what's really hard.
Yeah.
And it's about routine and discipline and method.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Saturn is the one that would demand proof for things. That you have to have these limitations, boundaries set up in order for things to come into being out of potentia.
Yeah, and to bring that down to the ground, it's like thinking of a garden, that if you
Mhm.
want to grow, let's say you want to grow vegetables to eat, if you don't corral those seeds into a soil and give it water and give it sunlight, you're not going to grow vegetables. You only are going to get the vegetables through containing it into a garden in the soil with a proper amount of water and sunlight. That's the restriction. That's the limitation. Limitation creates growth. When you give your body enough sleep and the right proper nutrients, you're healthy. If you don't, you're not healthy, right?
Mhm.
So these limitations provide growth. We have to have limitation and restriction in order for life to grow. It's the only way. Then you can look at it on a more philosophical, spiritual level by the body that is born and the body that dies. It's the limited time only life experience that allows us to be human. And that would also be the domain of Saturn. Like you don't get to live forever, in your
Right.
body. So like that, the limitation, and then there's also the sense of limitation of what you're meant to overcome. So it's two
Right.
aspects of limitation: the limitation that helps you grow, and then the limitation that prevents you from
Mhm.
growing. So if you have trouble doing what you say you're going to do, right?
Mhm.
That's a limitation that prevents you from growing. So then Saturn asks you to face that. How can you start doing what you say you're going to do? What is it going to take? And it's really hard. It's really hard when it's like, oh, it's so hard for me. I procrastinate, or oh, it's so hard for me to, stop eating sugar. Oh, it's so hard for me to,
Mhm.
like, blah, blah, blah. Like those, that sense of limitation where we're being asked by Saturn to face and overcome it.
Right.
And it's always in that realm when you want to overcome it to grow, it's always needing to repeat it over and over and over. This boring, dull repetition that creates growth, just like
Right.
the garden, right? You have to like be out there every day tending to it, and then it grows. Same with the things you want to overcome in your own psyche.
Right. Yeah, and it's the same thing like for artists. Like you can have everything flowing and potential in your mind, but until you work with the limitations of material to bring it into being, it just stays there in the mind. For it to be outside of the mind, it has to have some kind of constraint and form brought to it, and you have to
Right.
apply yourself to it.
Right. You have to put it onto canvas, onto paper, into the house you're going to build, the garden you're going to create, the diploma you're going to get. Yeah. So that's the realm of Saturn. Saturn gets a bad rap. Everyone's like, oh, Saturn, because it's hard and it's
Mhm.
repetitive and it's restrictive. And yet it's beautiful because Saturn allows for growth. It allows for the manifestation to
Yeah.
actually happen. So that is Saturn. And then Jupiter is the polar opposite of that. Jupiter's like more for everyone, expansion, growth.
Hmm. Yeah, and kind of along the lines we've been talking about, because Jupiter has an affinity with Sagittarius as an archetype. Jupiter
Yeah.
is about dignity and truth, um, but also, yeah, creativity and expansion and grow, 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 grow.
Yeah. Jupiter rules Sagittarius. So
Hmm.
that means, what is it? What's a simple way to say what rules means?
Well, I mean, I think when in the classical tradition, uh, all of the visible planets were given areas of given these archetypes as uh, being their part of their domain, or what they're kind of like the experts or something in those areas, or that's kind of what they do, their specialization.
Okay.
And
I don't
so
know if there, yeah.
when you're dealing with those things, like it's helpful to know that you're kind of in that terrain. So when you're dealing with the Sagittarius archetype, that you're dealing with this kind of expansiveness. So the dogma gets to be a problem because it like really ropes in that expansiveness. It does not allow things to keep growing. It tries to constrict it off and keep it in a very tight place.
Right, the shadow of Sagittarius. I feel like we tangent. Let's no, let's just keep going, because I feel like there's no simple way to talk about rulership. It's something you just have to just go along with in the language. Like Jupiter rules Sagittarius. Just go along with
Yeah.
it. It's hard to bring it down to the ground, but yeah, Jupiter expands whatever it touches. So if you're going into the shadow of Sagittarius and you're being dogmatic and fundamentalist, Jupiter is going to grow that, and then it's
Hmm.
tyranny and it's horrible.
Well, and it creates a lot of pressure uh, to keep the tight reins on things. Begins to be like a pressure keg, which is kind of like what Saturn and Jupiter kind of together are.
Well,
Uh, or to bring it back to a physical process, it's like the process of birth, the kind of contractions and the pushing of uh, the baby through the birth canal.
yeah, I feel
Uh,
like we need to really ground this. What Matt is saying is that Jupiter, which is expansion and it grows, whatever it touches, it makes it grow, it makes it get bigger. And
mhm.
Saturn is that restriction that creates growth. So Jupiter and Saturn together is one. There's our timer. Jupiter and we'll have to continue next week, but Jupiter and Saturn together is like birth, because Saturn is the constriction of the baby going through the body. It's really tight and constricted and really difficult. And then you just push and you push, and then it's like, boom, you're alive in the world.
Mhm.
Jupiter expansion.
Yeah,
So
and so we get that every 20 years. We come back.
Jupiter's going to it, Jupiter and Saturn together means that if you apply yourself, if you garden your garden, if you overcome your limitations, you're going to
Mm-hmm.
expand like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially the simple. But we should stop it there and then start
Yeah.
getting into the next part, so we stick to, because in honor of Saturn, Matt and I have committed to stopping when the bell rings.
Right.
So we're going to honor that restriction so we don't drain you from.
Yeah, so we'll be back again on another Mercury's Hour to probably talk about what all that means in terms of air signs and Aquarius in particular, so that we can think about how to honor that particular event in the cycle and like what it means for you kind of personally.
Yes, we'll go way into that conjunction next time. It's not happening till December 21st, so we'll be able to squeeze that one in, birth that podcast before the event itself.
Yeah.
So,
And yeah, in the meantime, feel free to drop us a line at Priestess Mercury podcast at gmail.com or leave a comment in the YouTube or on the website.
and we'll see you next time.